Well, here we are at week 4 of the story, deliverance, a great story, the story of Moses and the deliverance of the people. As we start, let me get you to thinking this way. I was in my electronics class in 10th grade at Huntington East when right after lunch the principal came on the intercom and announced to us that President Kennedy had been shot. Where were you? What were you doing on November 22nd, 1963? I was standing in front of the dining hall at Cowan, the Alice Randall Dining Hall, when someone had put up on the roof there a little black and white TV, and we were all senior high camp standing around watching as Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon. Where were you on July 20th, 1969? It was December 27th, 1967 at Rock Eagle 4-H camp in Eatonton, Georgia, that I, as a 19-year-old college student, first really understood that God loved me unconditionally, and my life has been forever changed. You see, we recall our lives by events, not feelings, not emotions. And I hope that as we go through this story that you will focus your thoughts on God's mighty acts in your life. And we live our lives from that perspective, the perspective of the upper story and God at work, not just the events of the lower story. The Passover is one of those events in Israel's life that God gave them, and God that recalls God's work on their behalf. But that's jumping way ahead in the story. So let's go back just a little bit and see how we got there. Well, now you know Moses' story. You all have heard it. You've been around it. You know exactly what we're talking about. The Israelites had come to Egypt when Joseph was the prime minister there. There had been that famine in Israel. When they got there, they were welcomed. They grew to a great number of people. But when Joseph died, the pharaohs began to fear the Israelites, that they had become so large that maybe, just maybe, they would throw in with some of the enemies of Egypt and overthrow them. And so they put them into slavery, and it's now been 400 years of slavery, of building bricks, of moving rocks to build flood walls and pyramids. And yet the pharaohs are still afraid of the Israelites, and so the Pharaoh gives out a command that all the Hebrew males 2 years old and younger should be killed. Well, you know the story of Moses. Moses' mother can't do that. She hides him as long as she can. She puts him in a basket, sends him down the Nile. Miriam, his sister, follows, watching. Pharaoh's daughter finds him, pulls him out. Miriam goes up and says, "Would you like me to get a Hebrew woman to nurse this child?" And she thought that was a great idea, and so she did. And Miriam goes and gets her mom, who's Moses' mother, and Moses' mother nurses him and raises him in those very important formative years. Well, Moses continues there. His name means drawn forth, taken out of the water. But as part of the royal family there, he's considered a prince in Egypt, and he's given the best of everything, the best education that anyone could have. He excelled in all kinds of things, not just with education, but probably also in languages and in sporting events. All kinds of things. He had an incredible background. The society in which he was raised, well, it was characterized by pleasure seeking. To be a royal in Egypt meant you could have the best of everything. But it was a system, it was based on greed and on gaining and on getting more. Fine living accommodations, plenty of money to do anything you wanted, pleasure of every kind unimaginable. But as Moses even grew in that, we see that he was drawn to his own heritage. And you know the story. He's out one day and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he takes issue with that and ends up killing the Hebrew, and he buries him and thinks he's done it. No one is seen. The next day he says something to a couple of other Egyptians, and they say, "Are you going to kill us like you killed the guy yesterday?" And Moses was afraid that he might be found out, and so he flees. He goes to Midian, and there he lives for 40 years. He meets his wife, but after 40 years there, tending sheep and those kinds of things. He's out one day and he sees a bush that's burning but not being consumed. And he hears a voice that says, Moses, take off your sandals, for the ground on which you're standing is holy ground. God tells Moses what he wants him to do. And Moses says, are you kidding? You've got the wrong one. I don't talk very well. He begins to give excuse after excuse after excuse. And that's a story for another time. But finally, Moses consents, and he and his brother Aaron go back to do what God has told them to do. But he says, who am I supposed to tell these Israelites who sent me? And God says, you tell them I am sent you. So they go back and they approach Pharaoh, and you know the story. Pharaoh says, are you kidding? I'm not letting these people go. They're too valuable to me. And so Moses begins to bring about the 10 plagues, showing God's power. The first 9 plagues, well, at times Pharaoh says he'll let the people go, but he never does. But it's the 10th plague. It's the death angel. The firstborn of all the males in Egypt are going to die. Moses tells the Israelites to sacrifice an unblemished lamb or goat, take the blood and spread it on their doorposts. You know the story. And there will be, the death angel will pass over those households. Death would spare no household except those that have the blood spread over the doorposts, the door frames. Well, you know the story. There's great grief that night in in Egypt. Even Pharaoh's son dies. Pharaoh tells Moses, look, get your people, get out of here or we're all going to die. And so that night, between 1 million and 2 million Israelites begin to gather up their stuff. And Pharaoh says, look, take whatever you need. And so they take all that they think they might need. People give them gold, they give them other kinds of things, and off they go. Well, Pharaoh has a change of heart and begins to chase them, and you know the story. They get to the Red Sea, and people grumble and say, if you brought us out here to die in the desert, it'd be better if we'd just stayed in Egypt. But God tells Moses to raise his staff. He does. The Red Sea parts. You know the story. They go through on dry ground. Pharaoh's army pursues them. God tells Moses to drop his staff, to lower his staff, and the water pours in and drowns Pharaoh's army. And yet the people still grumble. What are we going to eat? We're thirsty. What are we going to drink? All of that. They've been freed. But here they are, grumbling. God supplies their every need. He's delivered them. And yet they still do not recognize what he's done. So what does all this teach us? Well, real quick. This story teaches us a number of things. The lower story teaches us about God's upper story. First, here God reveals his name. I am that I am, he said to Moses. Who sent you? Tell them I am sent you. That's where we get the name Yahweh. And he chose Moses. And when the people ask God's name, Moses says, I am sent me. But not only does he reveal his name, but he reveals his power, and we see that in those plagues. You see, every time that a plague came, it addressed one of the gods of Egypt, and Egypt had many gods, and Pharaoh believed, in fact, he was a son of the god Ra. Question is, which god was most powerful? And so each plague, God showed his power over one of the gods of Egypt. But it's that 10th plague where God reveals his plan to get us back. You remember the blood of an unblemished lamb spread on the door frames of their houses? When the destroyer came, he would pass over that house. Now, what does this mean for our stories? Well, there's so much here about Moses. Let me focus our thoughts real quick on that Passover, what it means for us. The Passover has been a time for Israel to remember God's power and how he acted on their behalf. Before they would remember any of this, they needed to be released So look at these truths. To receive God's release, you must recognize your need to be released. Before they could experience the Exodus, the Israelites had to recognize that they were slaves. And see, the problem is the nature of slavery is such that when you've been in it so long, you begin to take that as normal. And, well, you just don't think about yourself being in bondage. TV talk shows have done that to us in our culture. They've taken the most bizarre, the most profane, the most immoral, the most crude, and made it seem normal. And the most enslaved people around are loudly on those shows declaring how free they are. Yet they're the most enslaved people around. You see, people who've lived in moral bondage for so long don't see it as bondage anymore. To receive God's release, you need to know your need to be released. But to initiate God's release, you have to act in faith before you see results. You see, God told the Israelites to trust me. He sent plague after plague after plague after plague. Now the hail has melted, the water's receded, it hasn't, it's turned back to water from the blood, all of that. The flies and frogs are still there. But God tells them, you've got to move, trust me, before you see results. And then Moses says, look, put blood on the doorposts of your house. Really? Nothing else has worked. We're still here. Why are we going to do that? Moses simply said, put the blood on the doorposts. You have to act before you see results. Time after time, God asks us to take a step of faith before we see the results we want. Why? Not because he needs it. God knew who was in each of those houses. He knew where the faithful people were. He knew where the Israelites were. But they needed to do it because they needed to do it, to recognize God for who he was. But also, when you're in slavery, to live in God's release, you need to understand it's a journey. It's not just a one-time release, then you go and you're free and you do what you want. It's a daily journey. You see, the Israelites were freed that night, but they were also freed day by day as God worked with them. That's what I want you to see. Deliverance. Deliverance. God reveals himself, he reveals his power, and God says to us, sometimes you have to act before you see results. It's trusting God. It's moving forward. Now let's see what Randy Frazee has to say.